Hi, TheHande here, and today we are continuing on this series of videos on Finnish schools, and today I'm tackling another contentious topic about Finnish schools, which is the status of Swedish in Finnish schools. Now, I've been thinking about different ways I wanted to approach this topic. So first of all, I think I wanted to just talk a little bit about my own history with Swedish. Now, I haven't really talked about the Finnish grading system in schools. It's a bit different from, let's say, the Anglophone system. Finland uses number grades, with 10 being the best and 4 being the worst, essentially a failing grade. Now, I was a pretty okay student when I went to school, meaning that in most subjects, depending on whether or not I liked it, I would either get 8s or 7s, and the best grade that I ever got in a report card was a 9. If I ever got a 10 in any subject, I think it might have been just like a one-off, maybe like a vocabulary test in English or something. But the point is that I was a pretty average student for my day. But even so, I will admit Swedish was probably one of my weakest subjects, with me very regularly getting 6s when I was studying it through years 7, 8, and 9. In high school, however, I did very briefly manage to get it up to a 7, although in the last couple of courses I did in high school, it dropped back down to a 6. My high school was also one of the very first ones in Finland that didn't require Swedish in the matriculation examination, so naturally I didn't do it, but I still had to take a course of Swedish in university, because in almost every degree program in Finland you always have to prove that you have at least a basic understanding of Swedish before you graduate. And so, let's talk about this. Why is Swedish a subject in Finnish schools? Now, as I talked about in the religion video, the reason why anything is in the Finnish school curriculum has to do usually with the fact that it has to somehow relate to Finland as a whole. Historically, Finland was of course a part of the Kingdom of Sweden. You'll need to understand, of course, that the country known as Finland has only existed since 1917, and even as an identifiable area with like borders and stuff, Finland only really started to formalize somewhere around the 16th century. And again, this was because the Swedes colonized Finland and turned parts of the country that would eventually become Finland into their provinces. Now, even though we were part of Sweden, Finland was obviously very distinct from Sweden, because while all the important people in power and the clergy and everybody spoke Swedish, the average common folk, of course, spoke this weird little language called Finnish. Nobody even knew how to write it until this guy called Michael showed up and did that for the first time. And Swedish continued to actually be the language of the higher classes in Finnish society, even once Finland was annexed into Russia during the Napoleonic Wars. However, it was also during this time that we started to have the birth of Finnish nationalism. This is something that I've talked about in my Leaders of Finland videos, for instance, which was called the Fennoman movement. So even the higher classes in Finland that spoke Swedish had started to consider themselves separate from the Swedish-speaking people living in Sweden. And although things like official documents and everything tended to be still in Swedish around that time, a lot of the higher classes in Finland really wanted to start advocating for Finland to become its own thing. And as a result, in order to strengthen that tie, people started using Finnish more aggressively, and even a lot of those former noble families of Swedish birth even started translating their last names into Finnish. The prominence of Swedish in Finnish society really started its downfall during the early 20th century, or just a couple of decades before Finland actually formally became an independent country. For instance, universities in Finland used to exclusively teach in Swedish, but by the start of the 20th century, even that started to go away. But even as Finnish finally kind of took over as the de facto language of Finland, people speaking Swedish as their first, and in some cases even their only language, never really stopped being a thing. Even to this day, there are still people in the Finnish coastal areas who speak Swedish as their first primary language when they grow up, and just speaking from personal experience, there are a lot of Finland Swedes that either speak absolutely no or just very limited Finnish. Therefore, ever since Finland became an official country, Swedish has always carried an official status as Finland's second official language. And this is the reason why it is also a mandatory school subject in Finnish schools. And to put it mildly, this is something that a lot of Finns have very heated opinions about and think it's completely unfair that they need to learn Swedish, despite the fact that the vast majority of Swedish-speaking peoples might not live anywhere near them. And as a result, for a very, very long time, there have been people advocating for the removal of the mandatory subject status of Swedish in Finnish schools. So that's something that I need to emphasize here just so that we get our bearings straight. That there aren't like people saying that Swedish shouldn't be taught in Finnish schools at all. Well, okay, there are probably some people who think about that. But the reason people get upset about Swedish in Finnish schools is the fact that it is indeed a mandatory required subject that you have to study starting from the final years of primary school all the way up to the university level. And indeed, because Swedish used to be a required subject in the matriculation examination that I discussed in my video about the Finnish school system, that in the past used to be probably one of the biggest incentives for people to even consider taking Swedish seriously as a school subject. But nowadays, there are basically no required subjects in the Finnish matriculation examination. Now, this has not caused Swedish to completely die out as a choice in the ME. On the contrary, lots of Finns still do take it. And one of the big reasons is, of course, that if you do really good in it, then you can probably avoid having to take extra Swedish in university. But I find it kind of funny that Swedish is the thing that causes so much vocal outrage, because there are other subjects that I think Finnish students generally are worse at. Now, the generic argument for why mandatory status of Swedish should be removed from the Finnish curriculum is the old, this thing is useless and that's why we shouldn't be teaching it. Which, as a teacher, I'm going to be honest, I have a hard time taking this criticism ever seriously, because this exact same argument is basically used for any subject that students don't like. Whether it's physical exercise or mathematics, and the people who make this argument really don't seem to understand the point of, well, teaching anything in schools. Now, the alternatives, however, that people are proposing for Swedish in Finnish schools is that Swedish should be placed in a similar status with other languages, meaning that it should be an elective subject and not something that everybody has to take. Also, people feel that there should maybe be a little bit more regional autonomy on this topic. Like, yes, in areas of Finland where there are large concentrations of Swedish speakers, learning Swedish makes a little bit more sense. But in the past, for instance, people living in eastern Finland have advocated that instead of Swedish, people should be studying Russian because Russia is like right next door. I don't know if this viewpoint has changed in the last couple of years. And in all fairness, I should also point out that there are certain exemptions that allow certain students to not have to take Swedish in Finnish schools. But this has to do mostly with students that don't speak Finnish as their first language. Now, I have a little bit more sympathy for the people who think that Swedish could be possibly replaced by another language. I think that kind of a decision would require a pretty big overhaul of the Finnish lesson hour system as a whole. But I also do have to say that I have a little bit of sympathy for teachers who have to teach Swedish, because I get the feeling like Swedish has kind of gotten the rough end of the stick in the last couple of years. So back when I was in school, Swedish started during year 7, but these days it started during year 6, or in other words, the final year of the lower grades in the Finnish primary school system. Originally, I think the thinking behind this was that kids would pick up Swedish a lot easier if they started it when they were younger. After all, English in the Finnish school system is already started during year 3. But from what I've heard from Swedish teachers, this has not really materialized, because the way that they did this shift was not by adding more Swedish lessons, but by rather just stretching out the pre-existing lessons across 4 years instead of 3, meaning that there's fewer Swedish lessons per school year overall. In other words, the Ministry of Education just totally screwed the pooch on that one. And here's the thing, because so many kids struggle with Swedish during years 6 through 9 these days, these problems tend to then carry over to their high school studies. Indeed, while Swedish is no longer a required subject in the ME, it is still a required subject to get your high school diploma. And I think all of this is just a sad statement on the lack of value that is given to languages in Finnish schools in general. So here's the other thing. I actually did elective German for several years in the Finnish school system, and while I have to be honest, I wasn't a great student at that as well, it did eventually give me a basic competence, and these days I actually do kind of understand whenever German is being spoken around me, or if I happen to see German somewhere along the way. But these days, kids are very resilient to the whole idea of even studying other languages, and another general criticism being that most people think that English is the only language that you require. Now, I'm not denying that English isn't an important language, although funnily enough, some years ago there was actually a little bit of pushback with some parents actually complaining that there was too much English being taught at Finnish schools. But again, I think this is completely missing the point. And I think there's value in studying just any foreign languages, and in order for that mandatory status of Swedish to go away, that would basically just require that Swedish as a whole would not be recognized as an official language, which I'm not sure there's any Finnish government that would actually push for that kind of thing. Albeit, yes, the official language status thing is a bit arbitrary because, for instance, Sami, which is definitely an indigenous language to Finland, doesn't have that official language status. And in Lapland, what they do instead is that schools will just mandate that certain lessons will be held in the Sami language, and they're trying to basically revive it that way. But there's also the thing that Sweden is like our neighbor and close partner, and I think there would be like some intrinsic value in just kind of understanding what's going on over there. As for the other more generic benefits that people tend to tout about learning Swedish, like it also gives you basic understanding of Norwegian, Danish, and Icelandic, but that's not the same as like getting fluency in those languages. It's just kind of useful if you're also studying those languages because you then get a general understanding of like the big differences between the languages. But here's the thing, the point of school is not to make you an expert in any of the subjects, because the reality is most people don't remember the vast majority of stuff you are taught in schools. The goal is to get a good basic understanding so that you know the vastness of knowledge that there is, but once you're out of school, you're basically on your own. You need to have the skills to figure this stuff out by yourself because, there's not going to be a teacher there to help you out with this stuff. And this goes for everything, not just mathematics, not just for natural sciences, not just for literature, but also just languages in general. Vi lär oss språk, ingen så vi ska bli experter på språken, men så att vi ska förstå de människor som använder språken. Om du bor utomlands eller i en område där de använder en andra språk, du kan överleva, survive, med engelska, men du inte lever riktigt där om du inte förstår kulturen, media och människorna runt dig. Därför är det viktigt att lära språk. Jag är TheHande Mäkinen, vi ses!